This is the second video I'm recording covering completing the square. So if you haven't already seen the first one or you weren't present in class for that lesson, you really should go back and check that because this particular one's not going to make as much sense to you. So in the first video, in the first lesson, all of the standard form equations that we worked with all had a values of 1. When we don't have that, things get a little bit more complicated. Not a ton, but we do have to make a small change and then add an extra step. So we're going to convert, let's try y equals 3x squared plus 24x plus 11 to vertex form. And so that 3 out front is going to make us have to think a little bit harder. So if we think of our vertex form again, that's y equals a times x minus p squared plus q. So we're going to keep that in mind. First things first, our first step is exactly the same, so we're going to put brackets on. So remember, your first two terms, you want to separate them out. So for us, that's y equals 3x squared plus 24x, and those are both going to be inside of brackets, and then that plus 11 is going to be on the outside. So that hasn't changed. Our second term, our second step rather, is one of the new steps. So this is where things start to change. If you look at your vertex form, you'll notice that the a value needs to be on the outside of the brackets, but for us, it's currently on the inside, and we don't want it there. So step 2 is we are going to factor out the a value. All right, so we're going to do this like common factors. We're not actually doing common factors here. We always take out the a value, even if it's not common to both terms. So even if you end up having to, say, divide a 7 by 2 or a 15 by 4, you still have to take that a value out. Quick little refresher off to the side here, if you can't remember how to take out common factors. Say we had something like 2x plus 10. We're looking for something that goes into both terms. So what goes into 2 and 10? In this case, that's going to be 2. When we do that, what stays behind is x plus 5. We can also take out variables, but again, we don't want to do that here when we're doing our completing the square. We just want to take out the a value. We don't want to take out any x's. So for us, we're going to take out a 3. So that's going to look like y equals 3. And then what's left is x squared plus 8x. So we have to do 24 divided by 3 plus 11. And so just a little reminder over here. You remove factors by dividing. This is a really common point of mistake. So either people will forget to take the a value out altogether, or they'll only take it out from the x squared term, and then they won't touch the b coefficient. So a lot of people on this might have something like 3 and then x squared plus 24x like this, and that's no good. That's going to lead us to having very wrong answers. All right, so that's our first change. Our next step is one that we're familiar with. So we've got this stuff in the brackets, and what we want to do is we want to take our b coefficient and we want to divide it by 2 and square it. So that is still the same. We divide by 2 and we square. So y equals 3 and then x squared plus 8x. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 4 squared is 16, so I'm going to add 16 and subtract 16 in the brackets, just like we did in the first part of completing the square. And then I've still got the plus 11. All right, if you think back to the first ones, our next step would have been to move the negative 16 out of the brackets, and that is still the case, but there is going to be a twist on this. So we are going to move the negative term out. But the thing we need to keep in mind is those brackets, and therefore everything inside those brackets, is currently being multiplied by this a value. So remember, when you have a number outside of brackets, that means you're distributing that thing to everything inside the brackets. That's how distributive works. So if we're going to take that negative 16 and we're going to move it away from the brackets and consequently away from the 3, we have to actually do that multiplication. So our changed step is we are going to move the negative term out, but then we are also going to multiply it by a when we do so. So our first change was taking out the a value, and now our second change is multiplying it back through, but just by that term that we're moving out. So that gives us y equals 3, and so we've still got the x squared plus 8x plus 16 inside the brackets. And then we have the plus 11. And so now, instead of having a minus 16 on the outside, we're going to have a minus 48, because I had to do 16 times 3. And then finishing this off, it's just the exact same as it was before. So we factor and we simplify. So we've got y equals 3, x plus 4. So remember, it's just half of your b coefficient, but it's half of it at this step. So it's not half of the 24 that we started with. It's half of the 8 that we've now got right before we simplify. So x plus 4 squared, and then positive 11, negative 48 gets us negative 37. And so there we go. That's how you complete the square when you have an a value. So the rest of this video is mostly just going to be me showing a few different examples of things you might run into. So watch a few, see how you feel, and then feel free to move on. So our next example, just to mix things up, I'm going to throw some function notation in there. F of x equals negative 4 x squared plus 72x minus 9. The f of x doesn't change anything. You just treat it like a y. You proceed the exact same way. Okay. So going through this one with the video, our first step should be to take out the a value. We do have to be very careful here. So remember, our a value is negative 4. So if I'm going to take out that negative 4, I've got to keep that negative in mind. It's going to leave behind an x squared. This should always just be an x squared. Never anything else. No negatives, no coefficients besides a 1, just x squared. Our second term now, positive 72 divided by negative 4 is going to get me negative 18x. And then we still have minus 9. We divide by 2, we square, and we add and subtract. So 18 divided by 2 gets me 9. And then 9 squared gets me 81. So I'm going to add and subtract 81. Still minus 9. And now I have to move that minus 81 out of the brackets. But again, remember, this is where people make that mistake. So you have to multiply this negative 81 with this negative 4 as you move it out of the brackets. So negative 81 times negative 4 is going to become positive 324. Keep an eye on your negatives. Then finishing this up, we get f of x equals negative 4, and then x minus 9, so remember, half of negative 18, squared, plus 324. And there we are. All right. Let's try another one. So go ahead and give this one a shot for yourselves once it's up there. You are going to run into some decimals, but it's not the end of the world. So we got y equals 2x squared plus 14x plus 5. So pause here, complete the square to the best of your abilities, come back and see how you did in a minute once you're done. All right, so we've got y equals, I'm going to take out the 2, leaves me with x squared plus 7x plus 5. 7 divided by 2 is either 3.5 or 7 over 2. I'm going to go with decimals on this one because the decimals are relatively nice. And it's just easier to work with decimals than fractions most of the time. So we got 7x. 3.5 squared is 12.25. So I'm going to add and subtract that. We move the negative 12.25 out, and again, we got to multiply it by 2. So that's going to get me minus 24.5. And then finishing this up, y equals 2, then x squared plus 7x. Oops, sorry, forgot about that. Not x squared plus 7x, but actually x plus 3.5 squared, and then minus 19.5. Okay. Few more quick things. I'm not going to work through these last few examples. I'm just going to set them up. So we've got our first slightly different situation is y equals 0.625 x squared minus 3.75x plus 1. So again, we always want to take out the a value, no matter what. So in this case, it looks pretty gross because it's a decimal, but we're still going to go through and we're going to take 0.625 out, which means we need to divide both of those first two coefficients by 0.625, which is going to get us x squared. And then the second one actually ends up working out really nicely. 3.75 divided by 0.625 just gets us 6x, then plus 1. So really, I was just trying to show you, if you end up with a decimal out front there, it's not too hard to handle. You just treat it like you would anything else. If you end up going through and working through this one, you'll end up with y equals 0.625, then x minus 3 squared minus 4.625. Okay, the next slightly different example is y equals 2x squared plus 5x plus 6. And this is going to be one of those ones where you are going to end up with a lot of decimals. So you'll notice here that 2 doesn't seem like it's going to come out, but it doesn't matter. We take it out anyways. So if you take out your a value, we end up with 2 and then x squared plus 2.5x and then plus 6. I do want to emphasize this taking out of a 2 and dividing this by 2 is not the divide by 2 in square step. This is just me taking out the a value. I would now divide by 2 and squared. So dividing by 2 is going to get me 1.25, and squaring that is going to get me whatever it gets me. If you go through and work through this one on your own, just so you know, you will end up with y equals 2 times x plus 1.25 squared, and then plus 2.875. Okay, and then just a little reminder down here at the bottom for you. You always take out the a value. And our last slightly different example looks like this. Y equals negative x squared plus 3x plus 1. Not much different about this one. The one thing to keep in mind is that negative is still an a value. It's a negative 1, even though we don't bother writing the 1. And so we still have to take it out. So you take out the negative, and you can put a 1 there if you want to. I'm not going to bother. And so inside the brackets, we now have x squared minus 3x, not x squared plus 3x, plus 1. And once again, if you do that on your own, you'll end up with y equals negative, and then x minus 1.5 squared plus 3.25. And so that wraps up completing the square as its own thing. The last video for section 3.3 is going to be looking into some very specific kinds of word problems that are a little bit more challenging. So make sure that you've watched these last two videos and really solidified your learning of them, and then go ahead and move on to that one.